Good evening. We're back with more Marvel Snap. The patch notes for the January 9th, 2024 patch have been leaked. This patch will come out in 1 week, so I think it's important to go over these patch notes now because they may affect any buying decisions that players make in the next week. Some of you will be looking ahead at the collector's caches and trying to decide what you will spend your spotlight keys on and what you will spend tokens on. So we will go over the patches as some pretty important cards will be nerfed that you may have been planning on picking up, and you don't want to pick up a card that's going to get nerfed imminently. So let's take a look. The first card on the list is Loki. Loki is currently a 4/5 who replaces your hand with cards from your opponent's starting deck. Give them -1 cost. He will now be a 4/6. And he says transform your hand into cards from your opponent's starting deck and give them -1 cost. The only difference here is the difference between replace and transform. And that's an important difference because it means that Loki transforming cards in your hand will no longer add power to the collector because you're transforming and not replacing. So collector will not get any additional power off of Loki's ability. The developer notes Loki has been a force since release, fueling a new archetype that dominated the meta for a solid stretch. He shrugged off the OTA nerf. We needed another patch to implement a second change, so we took the time to play with some fairly different changes and monitor the metagame. So they decided to soften their approach after Loki kind of fell out of the meta a little bit in December. And they decided to nerf Loki by basically nerfing the collector. So this is consistent with their design philosophy. When they want to nerf a deck, if they can get away with it, they really never nerf the Series 5 or the Series 4 cards. They'll nerf the Series 3 or lower. And so they wanted to hit the Loki collector deck, and they decided to hit it by hitting collector, not by hitting Loki, which is usually their preference. I don't think that the Loki deck needed nerfing. I haven't seen it a lot in the meta. I don't think it's that good. I thought it was in a good spot. So I think this buff or this nerf is pretty outdated. This is going to drop Loki out of the meta almost entirely, though. I don't see a reason to recommend picking up Loki anymore. So if you're thinking about getting him with tokens, or if you're thinking about saving spotlight keys for him, there's no need any longer. He is going to drop out of the meta almost entirely for the time being. Next up we have Miss Marvel. Miss Marvel currently 4/5 gives +5 power to adjacent locations where your cards have unique costs. New ability, your adjacent locations with 2+ cards and no repeated costs of +5 power. So the change is you need at least 2 cards at the adjacent location to get Miss Marvel's buff. That's a nerf. In a lot of situations it's going to be a nerf. In some situations it won't matter. Developer notes this is a small change in scope, but we expect it to have a meaningful impact. We released Miss Marvel without requiring 2 cards, in part because we found it difficult to clearly communicate the effect when it had multiple conditions. However, something we learned from players was that for many of them, the default assumption was that 2 cards would be necessary anyway. I don't know anyone who assumed that from reading the card. Because we also weren't psyched about how well Miss Marvel synergized with Professor X, this change captures better gameplay while shaving off a bit of the strength. Okay, so here's the problem. I don't have an issue with nerfing Miss Marvel. This nerf doesn't make a lot of sense. What would have made sense to me is to nerf Miss Marvel to be a 4/4 and to provide +4 power to the adjacent locations, which would make her a 4/12 overall, which would still be an incredibly strong card. Does this actually nerf Professor X? So they are really objecting to the lockdown style of play. They're going to be fighting an uphill battle against players on that forever because In Marvel Snap, there are basically 3 ways to win reliably and win at a high level. Number 1, you can prevent your opponent from playing cards through the use of Storm, Professor X, Alioth, that kind of thing. Number 2, you can destroy your opponent's cards with or counter them through the use of cards like Shadow King, Enchantress, Shang-Chi. The third way is just to go straight power and try to position your cards so that you win 2 of the 3 lanes. Now, the straight power approach is the one that the developers seem to favor the most. They don't nerf that approach very frequently. They nerfed the destroy your opponent's cards approach. They nerfed Shang-Chi recently. They released a card that protects other cards from Shang-Chi. They nerfed the lockdown approach a lot. They seem to want players to gravitate toward the just play powerful cards approach. Now, the reason that players don't really like that approach is that because when you play that way, a lot of the time it comes down to guessing where your opponent is going to play. And or getting lucky with locations. And good players don't like to leave things to luck or to guesswork. Good players want to snap knowing they're going to win, while their opponent doesn't know that they're going to lose. Good players don't really want to make guessing snaps, at least in my opinion. But that seems to be what the developers are pushing for. And it'll minimize skill differences if they're successful. And players will always be trying to maximize skill differences, so players are always going to be fighting against the developers. And players like Lockdown because it allows you to deal with difficult locations, and it allows you to guarantee wins. And those desires in players aren't going to go away just because the developers keep trying to nerf it. But that is what they're trying to do. And they're trying to introduce more luck, always introduce more luck into the equation, less skill, minimize skill differences, while also kind of maximizing like pay to win differences, like good cards, wins. They're at odds with players, I think, in the design philosophy that they have for the game and their philosophy for monetization. They're at odds with players. It's frustrating for players who are trying to maximize skill differences. But probably, I don't know if it's good for players that are more casual or not. I've never really been a casual card game player, but I don't know, maybe it is. Anyway, is Miss Marvel still good? Yeah, she's still going to be top tier. The requirement of needing 2 cards might change deck building a little bit, but Miss Marvel's still going to be very, very powerful. Annihilus. Annihilus, previously 5/7, your cards with 0 or less power switch sides, destroy those that can't, is now going to be a 5/5. Your cards with power below 0 switch cards, so it's not going to switch these 0 power cards over. They have to be negative power, and Annihilus got hit by 2 power. That's a huge nerf. They just dumpstered him. I didn't think he was that big of a problem. I don't think you needed to do both of those things. I think you could have nerfed him to a 5/5, or you could have nerfed him to only have negative power cards switch sides that left him as a 5/7. That's a big, big nerf. Their notes, even though internal play tests successfully found most of the Annihilus decks we've seen on the top of the metagame, their performance was surprising. In particular, the strength of just playing Annihilus with Sentry and or Hood in decks with no other synergies had been very good. That can't have been a surprise to them. That can't not possibly have been a surprise that Annihilus with Sentry was good. During design, we widened Annihilus' condition to include 0, in part because we were worried it wouldn't be strong enough, restricted to such a tight set of targets, but clearly that's sufficiently strong. Given that's the case, we're restoring our preferred design that requires cards to have negative power and taking a little base power away from Annihilus. That might seem heavy, but Annihilus has been one of the most significant outliers in our card performance data for weeks now at every level of play. Even more surprising, Annihilus is performing better in our most competitive samples than anywhere else. Usually strength flattens up there. Okay. I mean, once again, they don't like the lockdown or junk style of play. And they keep nerfing things that are high skill, like Werewolf, Annihilus. Like, they noticed that this performs really well at the top end. They don't want skill-based decks, apparently, to be in the game. That is a bizarre philosophy from someone who loves card games. They're catering to casuals. Not a philosophy I agree with. I mean, you take a look at maybe the most popular game ever, online game, World of Warcraft. Well, it's probably not, but it's one of the most popular. It got its start not catering to casuals. It was a hardcore game. Those 40-man raids, the high difficulty and leveling. Then as the game went on, it got more and more casual. League of Legends would be the most popular online game ever. Not a casual game at all. The learning curve in that game is steep. That is a tough game to get into. They've made steps to try to help new players, but they've never really made it a more casual, accessible game. It's a brutal game. You don't have to make it like a skill-less game in order to be popular. That's ridiculous. I mean, Teamfight Tactics, tough game to get into, crazy popular. The more casual you make your game, the less staying power it's going to have. So this fanatical desire to nerf all the skill decks, that's not a good long-term philosophy. That just is not a good long-term philosophy at all. Anyway, if you were planning on getting an Annihilus like I was, that card has been dumpstered. No longer worth picking up, in my opinion. Next up we have Dracula. Was a 4-0 at the end of the game, discard a card from hand. This has its power. Now going to be a 4-1 at the end of the game, discard a card from your hand to gain its power. That's actually a nerf in some situations. We're still monitoring the discard deck's performance in the wake of losing America Chavez, and one of the cards most damaged was Dracula. In addition to this minor buff, reworking Dracula this way makes its text more clear. That's not a buff in some cases, because gaining power means that if you get hit by like Selene and Dracula drops power to like a 4-2, his power isn't going to be replaced by the card that he eats. So, like, let's say you were going to eat Infinite before, you would just be a 4-20. It doesn't matter if he was a 4-3 or a 4-10. He would still go to 4-20 at the end of the game. Now, if he was a 4-10, he would only go to 4-10 at the end of the game. So, yes, it's a buff sometimes, but sometimes it's also going to be a nerf. Particularly against a card like Selene, it's going to target Dracula a lot because it targets the lowest power card, and Dracula is usually going to be that. It would be yeah. Okay, a buff sometimes, a nerf sometimes. Well, Angel, when one of your cards is destroyed, this flies out of your deck to replace it. Now going to say when one of your cards is destroyed, this flies out of your hand or deck to replace it. Okay, that's a nice change. Small buff to Angel. I like it. Quake used to say if this is at the middle location, swap the positions of each location, is now going to say swap the positions of the other two locations. So the middle location will stay as it is, and the left and right will change. That will give you a little bit more control over the effect and allow for some neat kind of things. So I like it. It's a tech card. They note that they expect Quake to become an alternative to Scarlet Witch or a tech card against strategies like Storm or Legion. Once again, they don't like Lockdown. They're trying to make that very clear to players. Stop playing Lockdown and just play more luck-oriented decks, to which players are going to reply with a middle finger, and they're just going to find other ways to play Lockdown. Kingpin used to be a 3/4. When a card moves here on turn 6, destroy it. Now going to be a 2/3. When an enemy card moves here, afflict it with -2 power. One of the few remaining loose ends in our change to the move mechanic during the last patch was that Kingpin and Fisk Tower remained able to destroy cards thanks to Juggernaut. It's always been a source of confusion for some players. They didn't bother reworking Kingpin because he was weak. This change makes the interaction with Juggernaut match existing expectations because we consistently don't let unrevealed cards have their power modified by their effects. We also made the effect asymmetrical and tried out an aggressive set of numbers to see if we could convince players to consider pairing Kingpin with Polaris or Spider-Man in addition to being tech cards against cards like Phoenix and Silk. Another upside of this change is it adds good ways to adjust Kingpin via OTA and find the perfect spot. I don't think people are really going to play Kingpin, even with this change. And then the America Chavez change there is just it's basically a wording change. It doesn't really change the effect. Probably for coding purposes, which is fine. So, boy, I do not like this patch. I do not like it at all. I don't actually have a Nihilus. I didn't mind facing it. I did not mind that card. The Miss Marvel change, I don't disagree with nerfing Miss Marvel. She's very overpowered. I don't like the way that they nerfed her. It could have been simpler. And then the Loki change I don't think was necessary. Loki was a good high skill cap card. They just don't like skill-based decks. That's insane to me. Okay, well, so if you were thinking about buying Loki or Annihilus, don't. If you were thinking about buying Miss Marvel, this might change the priority a little bit, but she's still very good. No other changes to the buying recommendations. That's it. That's all for the patch notes for this. Again, this patch will be released in 1 week. Also in 1 week, there will be some cards dropping from Series 4 to Series 3 and some cards dropping from Series 5 to Series 4. So definitely don't pick up any of the cards that are going to be free shortly. That's all for now, and thank you for watching.